right, Zaid, thank you for coming on to the Apex Energy podcast. How are you doing today?
Good, man. How about you?
Very good, doing well. I'm excited to have this conversation, and you've got lots of good content online, and hoping to dive into a lot of these topics today. I'd like to just start by asking, could you just give a brief introduction to who you are?
Yeah, brief introduction. I've always been a competitive athlete growing up, so I played mainly soccer starting from the age of 4, went on to continue playing until like 25, 26, traveled to a few different countries internationally to try to pursue that professionally. Didn't work out for me. I say that's a good thing and a bad thing, just because I really wanted to achieve that goal. But at the end of the day, it really led me down this path of being more interested in health, performance. And then after my father had passed in 2015, when I was 18, from heart disease, that's what really led me down this path to then working with gentlemen, exploring these different ideas within the health space, especially circadian biology. So that's pretty much it for me. I think a lot of people come into this space with a really strong pain point, and for me, it was certainly that. So, yeah, I think just being relatable to a lot of people's stories, really.
Gotcha. And how did that lead you into alternative health, so to speak? I say alternative because it's just not mainstream. By no way does that mean that it's incorrect or less correct than mainstream.
Yeah. I just took a look at how centralized medicine was through my studies and how it came to be, the incentive structures, the fact that doctors only spend 15 to 20 minutes with each patient, the fact that doctors don't even know a lot around the circadian principles and mechanisms. And, I began to realize that this is a broken system fundamentally. And if we're going to fix it, we need to have a more comprehensive and holistic approach to this game. And as a result, we need to have a more decentralized view of health in general. I think that's just the best option here. And so I'm doing my best to try to speak with as many centralized practitioners and try to get this message across, because oftentimes it does come back as more of a threat to the system rather than something that will benefit it.
And tell me a little bit more about this holism that you spoke about. What's the difference between holism and the practice that contemporary medicine seems to practice?
Yeah, so you have reductionism on one side with centralized medicine, where these researchers and these doctors view the body from separate perspectives. This is why, if you look at how centralized medicine was made and sectioned off, essentially you have a liver doctor, you have a kidney doctor, you have these various specializations that use the foundation of reductionism in their thinking. Whereas holism comes into more of the opposite side of the spectrum, where we view the body as one system. So we understand that the heart deals directly with the gut, and the gut deals directly with the liver. And so I think that classic dichotomy between reductionism and holism is a massive one, especially for people's understanding of this overall game.
And where do you think that comes from? This kind of way of thinking or this philosophy, in your opinion?
I guess just trying to understand things from more of an obsessive perspective. I've always been kind of like in my head intellectual, and so I
Hmm.
want to understand how things work. So mainly, I think that's where it really comes from, and I want to get good results too. And I think to have great results, you have to have a holistic perspective.
Interesting. I completely agree. It's been the same experience with me as well. This dualism, this philosophy that emerged, it seems, within like the 18th century, 17th century philosophers, people like Rene Descartes, who separated the mind from the body, were so influential in the West, and it seemed to have bled into our contemporary institutionalized places where medicine is practiced. But that obviously does not apply. And reductionism, it doesn't make any sense. Just to add on what you were saying, you can't understand a living being by breaking it down into its inconstituent parts. And the philosophy seems to be, if we don't understand enough or if we don't have enough solutions, we have to break it down even further. But that doesn't seem to be giving a solution either. However, one interesting way of looking at health comes from this ultra reductionist way of looking at the human body, which is biophysics. So that's one of the names, or quantum biology. So tell us a bit about that. I know you're familiar with a lot of these practices. How can we look at the human body in terms of maybe perhaps the quantum or just the physics realm in general?
I think, when it comes to quantum biology, that label is deemed as confusing to a lot of people. When you go into quantum mechanics, a lot of things are counterintuitive. It gets very confusing quickly. But if we break down reality into its fundamental components, you have neutrons, protons, and electrons. And that's what everything is made of. Your chair, a ladder. So I think if we can understand reality and health from that perspective, then we can really zoom out and see how that trio interacts with things like the mitochondria, sunlight, melanin, deuterium. For me, it all comes down to the base layer of reality, especially in understanding the human body, which is where I like to take more of a reductionist approach, actually, and then horseshoe it up to a more holistic philosophy.
Okay, interesting. And how, let's dive into each of those if you don't mind. How does mitochondrial health or mitochondrial function get affected, or how does that relate to the biophysics of a system, do you think?
Yeah. So if you take a look at the electron transport chain, for example, within the inner mitochondrial membrane, I mean, when you get into these very tiny structures, they fundamentally operate on quantum biology rather than the typical standard of physics that we understand.
Hmm.
And so you get into the ETC, you understand that there are 5 complexes. The entire gradient of the complexes is designed to transfer electrons from complex 1 all the way to complex 5. Um, and it goes through various things such as proton tunneling. You have quantum entanglement within the system. It gets very in depth, and this is something that I'm still studying a lot. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that the human body is extremely complex, extremely counterintuitive, and we can't just keep throwing darts at the wall, so to speak, in trying to resolve these chronic health issues. We have to understand how the mitochondria operate at the fundamental level, and we have to take a more balanced approach and really just think critically as opposed to just trying things out for the sake of it.
Yeah, completely agree. And using Mother Nature as a fundamental axiom, right, instead of some other type of philosophy. We come from Mother Nature, so there's no way we can try to defy her. So, and let's talk a little bit about deuterium. What is deuterium, and what are its effects on a human body?
So from what I know, deuterium is a subatomic particle that is kind of related to hydrogen. I mean, hydrogen is ideally what your electron transport chain wants to use in order to function properly. But the problem with deuterium is that it basically is double the weight of hydrogen. And so when you have too much deuterium in the system, it essentially breaks the system. And as a result, that leads to a whole cascade of problems leading to basically every chronic disease, because at the heart of it, mitochondrial dysfunction is there. Um, and deuterium is found, I mean, usually higher carb diets contain a lot more deuterium,
Hmm.
processed foods, certainly, vegetable oils. But the interesting thing for me is that deuterium is actually, there's more context behind it in regards to where you evolve geographically. So people who are at more of the equator, they are able to consume more carbs that are higher in deuterium because sunlight depletes deuterium. So you can see that the more holistic full picture here, where it really is nuanced and it depends on somebody's location, somebody's context. Are they dealing with a mitochondrial disease? Yeah, just a few things that come to mind.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, from what I know, deuterium is, like you said, it's twice the size and it's heavier than hydrogen, and that messes with the function of mitochondria through its fifth protein complex, which is ATPase. It's the one that spins. And in order for it to function, it has to pump, I think it's in or out protons. I'm not 100% sure. But in order for it to pump out protons, it needs to be through hydrogen, H plus, and deuterium is much larger, so that actually does not physically fit into that pump, which causes mitochondrial dysfunction, and therefore it just messes with the body in general. That's as far as I know. And you said foods that contain lots of carbs and seed oils, if I'm not mistaken, contain lots of deuterium. So if we wanted to avoid this deuterium overload, which would cause mitochondrial dysfunction, we would eat a low carb diet. Is that what you're alluding to?
I think generally it's a good idea. If you are farther away from the equator, then you have to be more careful. So I would generally follow a lower carb type of approach, maybe even a carnivore, short
Mm.
to medium term, something of that nature. But if you're at the equator and you get a lot of sunlight, you're very tan, you have a lot of melanin, I think it's completely fine to include high deuterium foods that are nutrient dense. That's the fine line. That's the nuance.
Mm.
Um, Obviously, I don't recommend Cheetos or Oreos or any of this processed stuff because that's going to destroy, like you said, that AT pace in complex 5, which is incredibly fascinating, by the way. I mean, you're talking about quantum nanomotors in your mitochondria that pump out ATP and give you energy. And so all the little details matter here, especially with when you get into the quantum realm.
Okay, amazing. And let's dive into light now. You recently, actually just a couple minutes ago, posted a new post on Instagram, and I'd like to ask you, why do we get sleepy after a sunbathing session?
Good, right on cue. Um, so my hunch is that first of all, near infrared light increases the production of subcellular in the mitochondria. But then I've asked other people as well, and I think it's a combination of lower cortisol, that increased melatonin. What else? I mean, you have sunlight tapping into the endocannabinoid system. You have the activation of POMC, which then leads to peptides that are extremely powerful. So I think it's really an entire concoction, assuming that you do actually sunbathe for a given amount of time in a relatively high UV index.
Hmm.
And it's one of the more interesting experiences because it's like the same level of tiredness that you get before bed. It's quite profound, and that's why I like to segue it into like a 20-minute nap.
Okay, interesting. Um, so tell me a little bit about UV indexes. What is it? How does it differ throughout different times of the day?
Yeah, so the UV index is basically just referring to, in my opinion, just the location of the sky. Like obviously you have, depending on where the sun is and where your latitude is, you have a certain strength to the amount of UV that's penetrating the atmosphere. And so for somebody like me in Southern California, I mean, right now we're hitting about an 8 UV index. So that's pretty toasty. I mean, you can get a lot of vitamin D3 through that. Whereas, certain areas like Ireland or Canada, they don't get as much UV. And as a
Hmm.
result, the UV index is going to be lower. And so you can actually track the amount of problematic symptoms and chronic issues according to how low the UV gets and the farther away you get from the equator.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. And how does this relate to getting morning sun and using morning sun as opposed to using sunscreen?
Oh yeah, because it's a perfect symphony. So if you look at how, I mean, for all the way from sunrise, you're designed to see sunrise immediately after you wake up, and then that crescendos into a nice gradual exposure around 10, 11 a.m., depending on where you are, into the higher UV midday conditions. And then you have a few hours after that, you head into evening, then you have sunset, and then it's total darkness. So
Hmm.
it's a perfect symphony created by Mother Nature, that we really have to align ourselves with. Because if you look at, I mean, it's pretty crazy. The stat that I came across is that we spend 93% of our time indoors. So as a result, we don't get enough near infrared or any of these other light wavelengths. Um,
Hmm.
7% is what in
That's
general as a
crazy.
civilian outdoors.
That's so crazy. And of course, we're going to have all these issues come out of that. Yeah, this is a very new phenomenon. We've evolved to be under the sun, of course.
Yeah.
Um, okay. And what about seasonal affective disorder? I read on one of your posts you said it's a problem. SAD, seasonal affective disorder, is a problem with low solar yield in darker environments. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so basically people who don't get enough sun, people who are in places that are darker, that don't have that high UV index like we mentioned. It's a huge problem because if you look at the fundamental reason why this happens, I think number one, you get so many benefits from the full light spectrum in terms of mood. I mean, vitamin D3 independently for mood is extremely powerful. But then you have to look at the POMC system. The POMC system is cleaved into multiple peptides. I mean, maybe 8 to 12 that we know of so far. And those peptides, especially things like CART, I think it's cocaine and amphetamine related transcription, and then beta endorphin are opioid peptides. So these play a massive role in terms of mental health, reducing pain, just feeling like in general having more well-being. I mean,
Hmm.
if most people go on a run, they have that runner's high. That's basically describing the activation of POMC and the endocannabinoid system and all these other things.
Okay, interesting. And does that also like another factor in how the sun or sunlight might make us feel better? Uh, explain to me a little bit about how our aromatic amino acids like tryptophan, phenylalanine, tyrosine get affected by light.
Yeah, great question. So they fundamentally work in tandem with light. So without the proper light signal that you get in the morning and midday, those aromatic amino acids don't act the way that they're supposed to. So if you take a look at how aromatic amino acids are set up, I believe they're made of benzene rings, which are photon traps. So they're designed to capture a photon, specifically UV light. All of them can absorb UV light wavelengths and
Hmm.
then use that to create certain byproducts. I mean, if we're thinking about phenylalanine, that leads itself to the precursors that are involved in T3, T4. You have DOPA, which leads to melanin, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and then I think one other one. But essentially, like it's the starting point of your entire neurotransmitter and hormonal system. So it's one of the
Yeah.
foundations that people need to understand, especially with morning light.
Okay. And what I wanted to circle back to vitamin D3. Do you find it an effective way of healing someone or raising someone's D3 levels just by supplementing as opposed to going out in the sun? Can it replace it?
It certainly can't replace it. I'm generally not a fan of vitamin D3 supplementation just because again, going into the whole quantum discussion with the body, what second, third, fourth order consequences does that have on the overall system? Knowing that the details matter. So that's one of the main reasons why. And then of course with sunlight, I think it's just superior because you get a whole host of other factors and benefits. Um, with UVB measure, that's where you actually create vitamin D3 via sulfated cholesterol on the skin. And I think if you want to have any strong chance of noticing any benefit in terms of the immunity, better bone health, better jaw formation, all these things, you have to get out into the sun and you have to properly sunbathe. The problem is that people don't have a good relationship with the sun. And heading into wintertime, they then focus on D3 supplementation. Whereas
Hmm.
instead, they should be like building a solar callus in the spring, developing that tan and melanin during the summer, and then ultimately utilizing darkness and near infrared light to then take advantage of the melatonin vitamin D receptor relationship to then take advantage of vitamin D3 in their body.
Okay, yeah. So it's just all circling back to you can't beat Mother Nature. It's all a coupled system. This overly reductionistic way of trying to raise a neurotransmitter or raise a vitamin, just meticulously by giving you a supplement, it's overly simplistic and just putting it from this perspective, even offensive to the complexity of our bodies and of our health. Yeah, just that's an amazing point, and just putting a nail in that coffin further.
Mm.
Um, Okay, so tell me a little bit about the lost wisdom of heliotherapy.
Oh, fascinating subject. So this is one of the basically the things that I discovered maybe a couple months ago, 5 to 6 months ago, where I've always liked to go into the past to understand these things and how centralized medicine approached some of these things, especially around light. And when you go back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, I mean, heliotherapy has a rich history. That's where it originally started. I mean, you have things like the rickets epidemic during that time. You have the move from agricultural society to more of like a city type of framework. And so people were getting less sunlight. You have the rise of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases that are highly problematic. So yeah, just studying the work of like Finson's work. I forgot his full name, but Finson is basically the person who created the research around heliotherapy, and then Auguste Rollier took that, ran with it, started sunbathing patients with all sorts of conditions like tuberculosis. I mean, spectacular recoveries. Like you
Mm.
have 6-year-olds who have advanced stage tuberculosis. Within 6 months, they're fully healed from
Wow.
sunbathing. And so we need to understand that, in the past, centralized medicine understood the wisdom of heliotherapy, which is why I find it ironic that centralized medicine today demonizes the sun, tells you to avoid the sun. It says that there's no such thing as a safe tan. It tells you to wear sunscreen, sunglasses, all these other things. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate that society has really found its way to this point. And I'm just trying to bring it back to really that lost wisdom.
And why do you think that shift has happened, in your opinion?
I mean, it's tough to say. I think the influence that Rockefeller and other powerful families had on the industry is understated. I think if you study the Flexner report, how centralized medicine came to be at this point today, that played a huge role. And then, of course, Rockefeller with his, I think with the big pharma kind of foundation and framework has pushed this whole discussion on sunlight to the edge. Like you're more fringe. You're a conspiracy theorist now if you say that sunlight is healthy for you and things of that nature. But really, I think it's just incentive structures, it's money, it's power, all the things that we find throughout history as common themes.
Okay. Um, and just, yeah, I found those images that you posted fascinating, where they literally have a baby, it seems, outside of a house or an apartment building, and they're in a cage. I mean, it looks a little unsettling, but the
It's
baby
sketchy.
is, it's sketchy as hell, but it's really interesting seeing all these babies just sitting and sunbathing. It's so alien to my modern eyes, yeah, I sense there's some deep wisdom, obviously, from everything you've been laying out. That would be incredibly beneficial to those children, and I want to kind of segue this into the children's health and the children's light exposure. And I find it that with many of these alternative, again, I say alternative just because it varies from contemporary medicine, um, people are a little bit more afraid and they're more reclusive to include these methodologies, alternative health, with their children and their infants, specifically when it comes to cold exposure or even light exposure. So, what is there any important developmental effects? Do you think? I'm not sure if you've done maybe the research yourself, but of exposing a child to sunlight and sunbathing them.
Yeah, I think in general, massive, massive developmental effects. It can really make or break the child of the health. So it's a huge difference. And I think people have touchy spots when it comes to children in general and all these health practices, because obviously we want to protect our children and we want to do the best by them. But that has to be underpinned with you have to have an extraordinary amount of education in order to understand what is good for your child and what is not. So you can't be lazy about this. And I think if you study the effects on vitamin D3 for a developing child, I mean, immune system, brain health, it really taps into everything. And I don't have specific studies that I can bring up on hand, but we all intuitively know that it taps into every system of the body. And yeah, just in general, getting that near infrared light. I mean, we know that near infrared light is able to pass through the cranium and get into the gray matter of the brain. We know that babies absorb more light, so they generally need less
Hmm.
time midday sunlight. I always like to you have to be more cautious with babies and infants, but the same concept applies. I mean, you want them exposed during the early morning to build the solar callus. You want them exposed a little bit during the midday to build that vitamin D3 and that melanin. And then most importantly, you want to block artificial light past sunset. That's something that most people certainly don't think about. And I think that if we have that full circadian framework in place, then we can set our children up to be very healthy and very robust, especially in today's society with all sort of toxins and things of that
Yeah,
nature.
yeah. And I want to get your opinion to stay on the topic of children and development. What's your opinion on sleep training? I know you're big on sleep as well. I've seen your sleep stats are very impressive. We'll get into that. But what is your opinion on sleep training, training the baby to go to sleep, and having them become accustomed to our modern day, industrial times or whatever it is, as opposed to us being accustomed to their biological sleep times?
Mm. I'm not a big fan of sleep training from what I've learned from my wife. I think that I mean, she is more obsessed than I am in terms of the baby development realm and things of that nature. So I'm just really grabbing onto some insight that she's gained. But yeah, I don't think sleep training is ideal because, again, you're going against Mother Nature. Everything that
Yeah.
Mother Nature cultivated in the context of humanity and biological systems, it's perfect. It does not need to be touched by these reductionist views of sleep training, and we have to put our baby to bed at this time. If not, then the whole night is off. Um, so yeah, I think also if you look back into history, there were a lot of stupid ideas around childcare and things of that nature. You have people saying that it's actually a negative thing to hug and give your children affection because it will then indicate some sexual frustration on the mother's part, like some weird ideas from the
Yeah.
late 1800s and early 1900s. So yeah, just a
Yeah.
few.
That to add on what you're saying, that idea fundamentally actually came from a psychologist. He was a pioneer in the realm of behaviorism called John B. Watson.
There we go.
And yeah, these guys were early 1900s, late 1800s. They wanted to make psychology strictly scientific because they were combating these psychoanalysts at the time, Freud and Jungian psychology was becoming very popular. So there was this pushback against this, woo woo. It seemed like woo kind of science because you couldn't you couldn't measure it and you couldn't look inside of the person's mind, and there's no such thing as an unconscious or conscious. You couldn't measure it and quantify it. So there was this pushback, and these guys were hardcore reductionists, and they saw everything as essentially as mechanical, and they applied that to the human being and to development. And John B. Watson came out with this book. It was highly influential in the United States, and he essentially was one of the biggest people, the biggest professors to push this idea, positive and negative reinforcement for children. And this was obviously along with B.F. Skinner, the guy who was feeding pigeons and rewarding them for doing a certain behavior and punishing them for doing bad behaviors. So they try to apply this philosophy to children, meaning if you hug a child too much, that's positive reinforcement, and they're going to get attached when they grow older. In fact, I think a lot of people in today's day and age still have this idea that, oh, you shouldn't give a child too much love or affection because they'll get used to it, and et cetera and so on. But that's a different subject. But what essentially happened to get to the point was John B. Watson's own children, four of his children, had a complete mess of a life. One of them committed suicide. One was completely addicted to drugs and alcohol. Another one was put in an insane asylum, I'm pretty sure. And just these terrible effects, and that just kind of shows you the result of this kind of philosophy. So
Yeah, I mean, you can't view reality from a mechanical perspective because essentially you're just stripping away the life and spirit away from what you're experiencing day to day. And I think if you do that, you really get into some tricky and nasty territory, some spooky territory, to be honest, because then, I mean, morality probably goes out the window, things around those lines go out the window. So it's an excellent point. I didn't even know the backstory to that. So that's extremely fascinating.
yeah. Okay. Now I want to ask you, if I were to ask you to steel man the argument of this reductionist, kind of mechanical science, how would you form that steel man?
Do you mean basically support it?
Support it, yeah. Play devil's advocate.
That's a good question. Um, I don't think I can. I don't think I
Really,
can
at all.
because it's antithetical to how reality works. Like you can't. I mean, when you start to think about quantum entanglement and how one atom here is connected to the millions of other atoms across the world or across the universe, that breaks everything reductionist in your mind. Like, there's nothing logical about that. I think it's, as a matter of fact, it's all like divine and just stunning. So I don't. What would you say to that? How would you steel man it?
I mean, in the field of medicine, I would say there are some aspects where it would be helpful. Like if I had a broken arm, that's a mechanical problem, right? It's a short-term kind of fix, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of things I think that modern. I mean, if I'm sick, I can take a painkiller and it can help with some pain. I mean, it's good with just short-term, simplistic stuff like bones. Again, I'm not a doctor, but just from what I've seen, obviously, hospitals provide a lot of benefit and can save lives. But
Yeah, I mean, no
yeah, go
doubt in
ahead.
my I do support the idea that centralized medicine is great for acute conditions and illnesses. So I'm not part of that crazy health Twitter sphere where they don't believe,
Yeah,
sepsis is not real. It's all a negative thought thing.
yeah, okay. Yeah, 100% sure. And especially when it comes to children and babies and infants, people tend to change their mind really fast. I've seen that. Some of the most hardcore health enthusiasts, when it comes to someone they love, especially like an infant, I mean, they go to the hospital, they do the stuff. They yeah, they take precautions, but they follow along a little bit at least. Um, okay, so tell me a little bit about, you also have another Substack article about exposing testicles to red light. What are some of the benefits, or exposing it to light and sunlight in general?
Yeah, well, I think if you I believe that actually, so let's start with this. I think, and I could be wrong with this, but speaking to a good friend, Dr. Abud Bakri, I think he mentioned that there's POMC neurons within the testicles. So that relationship between light hitting the POMC gene in your brain and then having more of a systemic effect, I think that plays a key part here. There was one study that I saw from a while back. I mean, I'm not, maybe early 1900s, that showed an increase in testosterone from, sunbathing the testicles. I don't know if that has ever been replicated. I don't know if that can be replicated, but fundamentally, I think if you get most of your skin exposed to sunlight, especially midday sunlight, there's going to be some sort of benefit to the system. Specifically, when it comes to building melanin on certain parts of the body, that's important because you want to generally have an even tan, or else you actually, in my opinion, you leave yourself open to high rates of, let's say for women, breast cancer if they don't actually sunbathe their breasts, things of that nature. So I
Hmm.
think there's benefit to it. I've noticed a subjective difference in my testosterone, like more aggressiveness, higher sex drive, things of that nature from doing that, but it's not something that needs to be done. I think in general, just exposing most of the body, the larger body parts are more important.
Okay. And before we move on from light to our other topics, I want to ask, like, can you still get the full benefits in your opinion from doing the practice like you talked about, like getting morning sunlight, sunbathing during the day, and then you talked about your nap, and then seeing the sunset perhaps even as an extra benefit for sleep and your circadian health in general? Do you think that is enough to replace our indoor activity in this modern day, as opposed to just being outside all the time like a hunter gatherer?
Mm. I think it certainly helps. I mean, there's no doubt that it certainly helps. The question is, what is the lifestyle breakdown of somebody like that? Like, are they spending 5 minutes outside in the early morning, 5 minutes during midday, or are they spending like 25 to 35 minutes? I think that makes the biggest difference. And then, most importantly, when you're inside, do you have the windows open? Do you have artificial lights on 24/7? These are things, especially after sunset. These are things that need to be considered in the overall context of somebody's lifestyle.
Okay, so what's ideal in your eyes for morning sunbathing? I mean, you'll give me a prescription, but I guess give me a prescription, yeah.
I'd say probably at least 20, 25 minutes in the morning.
Okay.
Most of this exposed. Uh, Depends on the UV index where you are latitude wise, but I'd say at least 20, 25 minutes during midday. Same thing,
Mm,
most exposed. And then definitely watching sunrise and sunset ideally, because those are the two anchor points, especially sunrise, where you have a whole cascade of biological effects that are extremely important.
okay, perfect. So let's move on to sleep now. I've seen you post your sleep stats a lot on your Aura Ring, and you have these crazy results, like 2.5 hours of slow wave NREM sleep, deep slow wave sleep, and something like 3.5 hours I think I saw of REM sleep, which is a lot. I work with patients or clients that with sleep, and rarely do I see a number go up that high. So what's your secret?
It's still, so I'll tell you, it's still relatively it, rare for me to hit 3 hours of, I mean, usually deep sleep is what I get into the 3 hour mark with. REM sleep,
Yeah.
I mean, I can try to push it to like 2 hours and 50 minutes. I don't think I've ever hit 3 hours with REM sleep. But I
Mm,
mean, the secret is that there is no secret. I have a really huge focus on circadian biology. So when it comes to the morning sunlight, midday, blocking artificial light after sunset, I am very strict about that for the most part. And then,
Mm.
I mean, when you get into other aspects of the circadian mechanism, you have Zeitgebers, which are otherwise known as external circadian cues. So you have the eating early on during the day is huge. So I usually stop my last meal at around 6:37. The earlier I push it, the better. And that after that point, no food whatsoever, minimal liquids as well.
Mm.
Uh, Outside of that, I don't exercise in the evening. I try to exercise during the daytime. Sleep timing is a huge thing for me. So the earlier the better. Once again, usually right now I'm in between like 8 to 9:30. I know that's still a pretty large window. I'd like to bring that down. And then things like cold, minimizing noise, having the windows open, all of these things add up to really have a solid sleep stack.
Okay. And do you think there's value in consistency, consistently sleeping at the same time? Would that have a synergistic effect later on, in your opinion?
Oh yeah, yeah. From what I've seen with the Aura Ring scores, I think that in the same way you can accumulate sleep debt, you can also accumulate a good bill of sleep, so to speak.
Wow.
And so I noticed that with my Aura Ring, I can't hit like 95, 96, 97 unless I'm very consistent day to day.
Mm. Mm.
Um, yeah, if one night I go to bed at like 10:30, 11, it throws it off and I'm back at an 85, 88.
Interesting. And how do you balance your social life with this stuff? Because I think this is one of the biggest issues I've come with sleeping early, waking up with the sunrise. Same thing with my clients is everyone wants to hang out, late at night, stay up, blue light. So how do you balance that personally?
You know, it's difficult. It was a bigger problem when I was younger. When I wasn't a father, I think the mere nature of having a 6 month old just means like, look, you gotta wake up at this time, go to bed early. Um, and Now, every once in a while I'll hang out with friends and be up until like 11, but it's not something that's common nowadays. And I think most importantly, I just try to fit everything in during the day. Like, if you have the ability and the blessing to schedule your time or schedule what you want to do during the day, ideally keep things during the daytime, mornings, afternoons, you have a good lunch with a couple friends, things of that nature. So really just trying to be more proactive around avoiding late hangouts. But even then, like every once in a while, it doesn't really matter, man.
Okay. Um, and tell me a little bit about the effects of REM sleep and NREM sleep. I know that they are imbalanced, meaning different portions or different times of the night we have different concentrations our body concentrates on. Deep slow wave sleep at a certain point and REM sleep at a different point. What would be the effect of someone, let's say, sleeping later than usual as opposed to waking up much earlier than usual?
Mm. So if you look at how, at least from what I've gained from an experience standpoint with my own scores, clients that I've worked with, from about it can be about 8 p.m. to all the way to 2 a.m. You generally have more of a bias towards deep sleep. So you'll see that most of the deep sleep takes place during that time frame, and really that's where you get that huge growth hormone spike. So that as Dr. Abud Bakri has mentioned, that one hit of growth hormone that's consistent during the first part of the night is more important than scattered bits of it. And so when you go to like 2 a.m. to around 7 a.m., then that's primarily where you have REM sleep. So I think the circadian breakdown is very important, which is why it's important to go to bed early and then to wake up not too late during the morning time. And of course, I mean, REM sleep is responsible for, emotional health, mental health, the brain more so, while deep sleep is more of a physical type of recovery with the tendons, ligaments, muscles. I think they're all weaved together, but yeah, that's generally how I would section it off.
Okay, who's Dr. Abud Bakr? You keep mentioning him. What does he do?
Oh, he's someone you need to get on the podcast. He's one of my good friends. He's so what's interesting about him is that he has a centralized background. So he's an actively working doctor to this day,
Hmm.
but his take on more of the decentralized focus is incredible. I mean, his understanding of melatonin and hormones and testosterone, sleep, he's got the whole thing broken down. So he's definitely
Wow.
who's a good pick for the pod.
Interesting. Yeah, kind of like Dr. Cruz, Dr. Max Colhane, centralized doctors kind of
I
making
think
the
Dr.
switch.
Agwood would be he's going to be big in the future for sure. So I can send you his details as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd appreciate it. Um, okay. Was I gonna ask? I was gonna ask you something, but yeah, I just can't think of it. Let's move on to water, and quality of water. What would be the difference to drinking something like real spring water as opposed to, tap water?
First thing that comes to mind is hydration status. So per ounce, I have found that spring water is way more hydrating than something such as tap water or distilled water. And if you look at how, again, going back to the whole idea that Mother Nature doesn't make a mistake, she's perfect. The way she crafts spring water is quite incredible. I mean, I've studied the life cycle of spring water. It goes through a very intricate process where the water is flown through a water vortex thousands of times during its life cycle. All of the minerals from the soil get basically infused into the water. The near infrared light structures it from another perspective. And then, I think in general, it's just high quality water that is not tainted by modernity. And if you look at tap water or distilled or any of these other ones, usually there will be some microplastics, some lead, things of that nature that really have an impact on the body.
Okay, and same thing with reverse osmosis water. Is that a way where you can kind of remove those things like microplastics and heavy metals from water?
Yeah, reverse osmosis is a good idea. If you don't have access to spring water, I mean, the thing about it is that I kind of relate it to antibiotics because not only does it remove the bad, it also removes the good. And so you have to put back trace minerals, like more of a complex trace mineral combination to then get the most out of it. And then I think it's important to structure the water as well. So usually like just putting it under sunlight for a certain period of time because of that near infrared, I think that's really powerful. Um, and outside of that, in terms of the hydration status, I mean, I've noticed a huge difference as an athlete. Like I would go through maybe 5 to 6 plastic bottled waters in my past during a game,
Hmm. Hmm.
still be dehydrated. But with like half a bottle of Mountain Valley or a glass bottle of spring water, completely hydrated and completely fine to perform. So I think there's an intuitive understanding and wisdom there that the body is pointing towards.
Okay. And what does an optimal diet look like to you? Of course, this would vary from one individual to another, but what if someone? Well, I'll ask individually. What's your opinion on red meat and eating things like a high saturated fat diet on health?
I have no problem with it. I think in general it supports health outside of people who have genetic predispositions like familial hypercholesterolemia. So I think for the people that it doesn't work for, that's where genetic factors are going to play a huge part, which is why I'd rather push those people to more of a monounsaturated type of approach as opposed to a saturated.
Okay, and what's your opinion on, let's say, like a something like a vegan diet?
In general, I think it's a terrible approach. You'll notice some benefit if you go from a standard American diet to a proper vegan diet.
Hmm.
But again, I think one of the hardest diets to follow. You have to supplement religiously and properly. And it's always going to be an uphill battle because if you are a very strict vegan, I mean, 6 months in, 5 months in, depending on who you are and your mineral status and things of that nature, you're going to have a rough time. So you'll notice benefits on the front end, but on the back end is where you see a lot of the problems with deficiencies, especially B12, lack of protein, lack of amino acids, things like that.
Okay. Um, and I'm just gonna bounce some questions off you, just get your opinion. What's your opinion on eating a raw meat as opposed to cooked meat?
I am not a supporter of that. I know there are
Okay.
health influencers that support raw meat consumption. Listen, I like my meat cooked, medium well, even rare. But the idea of me eating raw meat exclusively for the rest of my life is just absurd. But I think from a health perspective too, there are going to be some consequences for that for some of these people who are pushing it that are unseen to them right now. because they're reporting better digestion, amazing results. Listen, it's all a pro and con. So we're gonna have to wait and see what happens to some of those people.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and what about seafood? What would be the benefits? I know there's like a quantum biology aspect to seafood in terms of DHA and stuff. So how does that support a human body in your opinion?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of seafood. DHA acts like a semiconductor in the body. Many things act like a semiconductor. I mean, bone, certain cells, a lot of incredible capacity for. I mean, at the end of the day, the human body is electric. So, um, I think if we can get DHA from the smaller fish, wild caught sardines, salmon,
Mm,
mackerel, shellfish like oysters, you have shrimp, lobster. I think the more of that you can get in, the better, because it will allow your body to function in the most optimal way from a quantum perspective, especially in relation to how you capture photons from the sun, what your relationship with cold exposure is like, and then how effective those things are going to be going forward from a lifestyle perspective.
okay. So eating things like DHA, collagen, as you mentioned, all of those things increases semiconduction because chemical those chemicals are inherently just semiconductors on a physics standpoint. And then things like cold increases semiconduction as well, right?
Mhm.
And the sun relates to that because the sun, I know this from Dr. Cruz, interacts with electrons through the photoelectric effect. Um, so how does grounding fit into this as well?
Yeah, so grounding is also one of the, light water magnetism, like Cruz says. Grounding is one of those fundamental things that we have to discuss, because if you take a look at how the human body works, we have a system made out of collagen and ground substance known as the living matrix. And this system is essentially just designed to really transport electrons to areas in the body that need it. So if we notice a site of inflammation at the knee, for example, the living matrix, assuming you're grounding, will take electrons, um, and then basically transport it to that area to then facilitate the recovery process. But even like our hands, our feet, we have sweat glands. We have an
Hmm.
aqueous solution of sodium chloride in those sweat glands. And when you combine it with grounding to a conductive natural Earth surface, then those electrons can be taken up into the system and then go into the living matrix and then have all these beneficial effects. So it really is understanding that we quite literally are electromagnetic beings that,
Hmm.
again, are meant to be in link with Mother Nature.
And I actually wanted to bring this up to you. Whenever I hear this, the sweat gland thing on the hands and the feet, obviously Dr. Cruz always says make like the Sphinx, right? Put your extremities on the ground, like, so you can ground and then watch the sunrise or the sunset. Have you noticed any similarities between that and maybe some religious practices, ancient religious practices? Just curious. Any lines you've kind of crossed there? Because I do have some I'd like to present.
Well, I mean, my co-host for the 2 a.m. podcast, I've talked about this from the Islamic perspective. Like when
Yeah.
you're actively praying and you kneel down and you have feet connected to the ground, hands connected to the ground, ideally, if it's a conductive surface, you don't have a prayer mat, then, um, I, I mean, I would assume there's some ancient wisdom to that, right?
Yeah, I kind of went through this with Kenford Bitana, one of my friends, and I realized in my head as he was telling me this stuff, I was like, dude, in Islam, you're supposed to do 5 prayers a day at different times according to when the sun is in the sky. So there's a sunrise prayer where you have your extremities on the ground, you have your knees on the ground, you have your hands and your forehead. Assuming obviously there was no mat, and back then they didn't have mats like the way we do today. They used to just pray on the sand. So there's that, and then there's a midday prayer, then there's an evening prayer, then there's a prayer when the sun is down. So I literally told him, I'm like, that's kind of like a good circadian blueprint right there. Some guy figured it out 1,400 years ago. The prophet, not some guy, but
It's
Uh,
circadian biology at its finest, man.
it's interesting. And then to add in one more thing is in Hinduism, they have the Sunyar Namaskar, which is the sun salutation, which is the same exact thing. According to when the sun is positioned in the sky, you're putting your hands up, you're putting it down on the ground, you're putting your extremities on the ground. So there's no wonder there's some deep ancient wisdom there. And people did, obviously we know now from this information, heal from their health problems with these practices. That's yeah.
Oh
Anyways,
yeah.
so tell me, let's go back to food a little bit. What about raw milk? What are some of the benefits of drinking raw milk as opposed to pasteurized milk?
Yeah, so I love raw milk. I think it comes with it's a complete food in my perspective. It comes with the full range of enzymes, um, protein, right ratio to protein, fats, and carbs. You have a lot of sorry for the dog. You have a lot of bioactive substances and enzymes that are able to work in harmony with the body to then, produce some great effects on digestion, low risks of allergies, things of that nature. And the main difference is that pasteurized milk is really just, I call it denatured and really dead milk. I mean, the kind of the same way I like to call spring water living, um, and tap water dead. I think I like to relate the same thing to milk that's raw versus pasteurized.
Hmm.
Because if you just heat raw milk to a high temperature and destroy a lot of the things that are, really intricate in that system, then you're going to have some effect on health. And I don't think it's going to be a good one.
Okay. And why, in your opinion, again, is raw milk banned? Why is it not allowed in most countries?
So if you take a look at Rockefeller and his influence on the raw milk industry, yeah, he's had an influence on everything. So unfortunately, he actually, I believe, created a machine and had a patent on that machine to pasteurize milk, or do something with milk, something of that nature. And as a result, he would basically put it at a higher price and put all of the dairy farms out of business to then create a monopoly on the industry itself. And I find that extremely evil, for lack of a better word, because obviously it's like powered by money and greed. But I think that's where you see a lot of the guidelines on raw milk today, and the idea that pasteurized milk is way superior to raw milk.
Okay, interesting. And if I'm not mistaken, Rockefeller also, I mean, this guy was so powerful. He also had a hand in the modern educational system and the way it's structured. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think he put his family members on the board of like the main education thing which then influences all the other mini schools and things of that in all the districts like that. It's
Interesting.
actually crazy how much influence that guy has had in that family.
It's yeah. Um, okay, so I'd like to leave you with just a couple more questions here. This one I'm kind of curious about. I spoke to Dr. Thomas Seeger last week, and he is big into ice baths, but he also is big into green light therapy. And he told me about how it seems that it's basically a machine, just like near infrared light or just red light in general, but it emits green light, and it seems to help people with their headaches tremendously. Like any person with any kind of headache just puts this green light up to their head, and it seems to help them tremendously and remove a lot of those symptoms. Just going off, just obviously, there's going to be conjecture. There's no data behind this, but what do you think is behind that concentrated green light? Is there anything specific in our biology that is sensitive to green light?
I'm trying to think. I mean, yeah, there's no data on it specifically that I know of, but in my mind, it has to come down to either the chromophores or the non-visual photoreceptors that are linked with specific wavelengths of light. So I don't know, maybe rhodopsin is responsible for green. I think I wrote a thread on non-visual photoreceptors, and I have to go back to it, but I believe there is an opsin that is tied to green. So I think
Okay.
maybe through its interaction with that, and then how it probably interacts with inflammation in the brain, because I know it's really powerful, like just overall green light wavelengths for headaches. I've seen that myself as well.
Hmm. Interesting. So you said rhodopsin? Write that down.
Essentially, rhodopsin. I mean, you have melanopsin, which is blue,
Yeah.
um, cryptochrome,
Neuropsin.
yeah,
Yeah.
neuropsin, UVA. So I'm not sure which one specifically.
Okay. Perfect. And then really the final question I really have, I want to get your take on was you mentioned earlier that your father passed from heart disease. Was it a heart attack? Am I mistaken?
Yeah,
Um,
my
in
cardio was.
the Okay. And since that experience and you, Zaid, today, and the information you've accumulated, what's your opinion on behind the main causes or drivers of heart disease and heart attacks in general? Does it differ from contemporary medicine, or is it the same, would you say?
Oh, it differs. I mean, it couldn't differ any more from contemporary medicine.
I was
So
expecting that, yeah.
yeah, I mean, just the idea that the heart is more mechanical in nature. I mean, I don't know what they relate it to conventionally, but we do know this is the blood. So that's another, like, think of spring water and how that water vortex is created in nature. The same thing
Mm,
happens with heart and with your blood. In terms of the causes of cardiovascular disease, I mean, I think there are a lot of specific causes, but at its root, my philosophy on it right now is really a breakdown of the structured water within the blood vessels. I think
mm,
that if we take a look at the blood vessels, you have easy water, which is just structured water according to Gerald Pollack, that coats all of the arteries and veins. And if you look at the layers and how that structured water is created, there are a good amount of layers to the point where it doesn't allow things like lipoproteins to break through. It doesn't allow a lot of these conventional like ApoB or LP little a. It doesn't allow any of these molecules to break through into or past the artery wall, past the endothelium, the glycocalyx. And so I think when you have a breakdown of structured water in the blood vessels, then that can lead you down to some very problematic consequences with cardiovascular disease. And I don't discount things like LP little a or ApoB or high triglycerides on a blood panel. I think those are all important. But if we're talking about the intricacy of the human body as it relates to water, especially its gel-like state in the human body, we have to consider structured water in the blood vessels, and we have to consider the impact of sunlight, artificial light, and then things like glyphosate and other stressors, so to speak, on the system.
okay. And in order to obtain more structured water, we would go through all those practices that you mentioned, right? Light water, magnetism.
Yeah, grounding, AM sunlight, sunbathing, sleep. I think a lot of things play a good role here, but really light water magnetism at the end of the day, those practices.
Okay, and a couple more things. What about the high LDL, as you mentioned? Do you think that's could be a direct risk factor for cardiovascular disease through the development of plaque in the arteries?
Hmm. I don't think there's a lot of strong evidence actually to show that high LDL is a big problem. I think again we have to look at blood work like a constellation. So you don't, in my opinion, I don't look straight at one biomarker and then make an assessment. I have to look at the full picture. And when I go through the research on LDL, I'm not very convinced by high LDL causing heart disease or cardiovascular symptoms. I'm more convinced that, I mean, through the research, if you drive LDL down to a certain point, you actually see more cardiovascular events.
Hmm.
So systems thinking, extremely complex. Our bodies are extremely complex at the quantum level. When you recklessly throw an input into the system, you get a backfiring mechanism. Like
Hmm.
the best example of statins. Like you put somebody on a statin because they have high cholesterol or high LDL. We know that statins destroy the mitochondria. We know that it destroys CoQ10. So again, there are all these backfiring mechanisms from reckless inputs that we have to think about.
Okay. And what's the stuff about the heart being a pump and that being a controversy within this space and heart health in general? Why is that a controversial idea?
You know, I wrote a thread on this. I don't remember much of it, to be honest, because it was kind of complicated.
Yeah.
In terms of like the mechanism of the heart, I think people compare it to some sort of like mechanical system conventionally, when in reality it's much more dynamic, especially considering that it actually structures water, so or structures the blood. So, on that end, I think it's one of those things where we have more to discover. We have a lot more to learn, and everyone thinks that they understand the heart, properly. But if you look at certain experts within the industry, cardiovascular industry, I mean, some of the ways that the heart operates still confuses them to this day. So I think there's a lot
Hmm.
more to discover overall with it.
Okay, amazing. That's all I have for you today. Or do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to give?
Man, I've really enjoyed this podcast episode. I think it's definitely up there. It's one of the best ones that I've been on. So
This
props to you.
this is a yeah, it was a banger for sure.
No, you asked some hard questions, and I really like when people ask hard questions. So
Yeah,
I
I
appreciate
I appreciate it as well. Yeah, I got some really good answers, and I can't wait to listen to this again. I think you have a very you're a very articulate person, but just some of these metaphors like you use, like looking at the human body as a constellation. It's just it really puts things into perspectives and makes me understand the human health in general and quantum biology. So yeah, thanks for your great answers.
Yeah, man, of course. I'm definitely looking forward to what we discover in the health realm, 5, 10, 15 years from now. It's gonna be
Yeah,
exciting.
same. All right, man. Take care.
Take care, bro.